So Lucy and the Hawk is a comedy about loneliness and peregrine falcons. It's a comedy because it's optimistic, I think. It's about loneliness in the sense that it's about isolation and separateness and all the things that sit apart from each other in the world, whether those are ideas and the actual reality of a situation, or words and their meaning, or people and other people. It's a play for two performers that grew out of a bunch of different experiences of moving to a place that I didn't know at all and where I felt like I wasn't at home suddenly, of being out in the landscape of the Cheviot Hills in Northumberland, which is the most amazing place. It's really, really wonderful. Reading a book called The Peregrine by a guy called J.A. Baker, which is the diary of a man who was obsessed with peregrine falcons and who kind of wanted to be one. Is kind of the most remarkable record of obsession. And in a much broader sense, an interest in all the pairs of things that kind of sit in relation to each other in the world, but are slightly separated. What I'm referring to by that is things like a word and its meaning. Do you know what I mean? They're connected, but they're separate. Or perhaps, if you believe in that kind of thing, the mind and the body, or maybe the soul and the body, if you believe in a soul. And most importantly, perhaps, one person and another person. Because however closely you know someone, or however intimate you are with them, or however close your relationship, you're never just one person. There is always something slightly separating you, and that can be difficult sometimes. And all of those separations that I've just described are in some way a difficulty, I think, that we encounter in our lives and in the world, whether that's a difficulty when we're trying to communicate, or when we're trying to think about things, or trying to understand things, or whether we're just trying to not feel alone. Yeah. They're all really profound things sometimes that we encounter in our lives. And sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're just a bit funny and a bit inconvenient, or just a kind of an intellectual curiosity. And I'm kind of interested in both ends of that spectrum of intensity. So the play grew out of all of those interests. I wrote the stories, but then the play itself I devised with the performers. So obviously it's kind of co-authored in that respect. But the fact that each performer tells the other person's story while they're in the space and they can't speak is absolutely about that separation. So in any given moment in the play, you see what someone's doing, you see what they're experiencing, but you don't hear their version of it. You hear a soundscape and a narrative created by someone outside of that space. And that separation of the visual and the sonic or the aural is really about the same kind of separation that I just described, the idea that things sit next to each other and seem to relate but don't quite touch. Our devising process was slightly different in the sense that it began with a story or two stories, sort of these two characters, Lucy and Elliot. Elliot, who is seemingly perfectly content, and one day something comes into his life that distracts him and he never quite gets over it. And the other, Lucy, who's living a life that seems to be somehow unfulfilling, but she can't quite put a finger on why. And then something comes into her life that changes that and might provide an escape from that dissatisfaction. But then it was really a process initially of finding games that helped us find ways to tell the stories without sitting there going, what's the cleverest way to do this bit? Getting yourselves into a situation or a state where you aren't worrying about whether something's clever or right or not, you're just coming up with stuff, and then afterwards you look back at it and go, okay, that's right, well, we can use that. It's quite different to a text-based process when, as a director, you're guiding the actors through a journey of interpretation. In a devising process, as a director, you're kind of there and in on the game, and then you're the one who has to step back and say, okay, we've got to stop now, we've got to do this. So we began work on it a year and a bit ago, up in the northeast in Newcastle, and it grew out of some time I spent there at Northern Stage. It's a brilliant theatre, on a scheme called the Regional Theatre Young Directors Scheme. And essentially what it does is it pays for you to work as a trainee director for a year in traditionally in a regional theatre. And the idea is for you to have a chance to be based somewhere and have a bit of stability for a year, and to learn about all the different elements of running a building. Theatres like Northern Stage have a different kind of relationship to their audience to theatres in London. Because there are so many different theatres in London, so many different types of theatre, you know, what you end up looking at is an audience that's not so much geographically based as kind of taste based. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of new, interesting, innovative work is their remit, but for a geographically based audience. So you have to, and there's a sense in which if you're the only place doing that in a particular region, you have to kind of advocate for that work as well, in a way that perhaps you don't if you're the Young Vic. Different venues have different kinds of audiences, different relationships with those audiences. Different audiences have different expectations. So I was there for a year and a half actually in the end, because I stayed on to do a couple of other things. And while I was there, I met Tom and Abby, the performers, and other members of the team now who were involved then were Ollie Lamford, who's my co-director of Switchback. He's been dramaturging it the whole way through. Who else? Cecilia Carey, the designer as well. And Lucy, the stage manager, Lucy Crimmins, and Becky Darlington, the producer. All of these people have been involved in it in the off, and it's a very sort of open, creative conversation actually. So Ollie and I are Switchback. We're the two people in the company. Everyone else is kind of on a kind of project by project basis with us, but they're all kind of long-standing collaborators. We really want to work with them again. So Becky, for example, is the most brilliant producer ever. Then, of course, what you do is you look for collaborators as well, who aren't necessarily a full-time part of the company, or they might become one, but who are people who you go to and you think, right, we know you can make this happen. We want to work with you all the time. Or with performers, it's just about you find as a director, you find performers you like working with, and then you probably stick with them, I think. We did a tour of the North East before we came down here. So we went to Alnwick Playhouse in a very beautiful town called Alnwick, which is an amazing second-hand bookshop, or Barter Books. Queen's Hall in Hexham, which is another lovely town in Northumberland. Arc at Stockton, where we are an associate company and who've been absolutely brilliantly supportive, and at Northern Stage. And that's a really broad range of audience, from people who are just generally interested in all kinds of artistic practice, to students, to older people, all sorts. And I had a lovely conversation after the show at Alnwick. We had 40 odd students school students, sixth form students, who'd done a workshop that we provided in the day. And I had a really lovely conversation with them afterwards, in which they were all telling me what they thought it meant. And it was brilliant to hear that, because it's quite an open play, it's quite an ambiguous play in terms of what happens in it at times. And it lives best when an audience encounters it with a sense of curiosity and the desire to imagine what's happening, as opposed to the expectation that they're going to have everything explained to them. There's 3 words I would use to sum up Lucy and the Hawk. I'm going to be horribly abstract, I'm afraid. Are blue in the sense of the colour, not in the sense of being rude. It's so hard, there are so many words. So blue, upwards, and warm. So there you go.
Very, very. And can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing with the Palace 100?
In Southend?
Yeah, seeing that's coming up.
Yeah, sure. We're telling a bunch of stories of the history of the Palace. I mean, the Palace Theatre is an amazing place. It's basically, in its 100 years, has been home to pretty much every style of theatre you can possibly imagine. And the play we've made is one that tells 3 kind of central stories. One set in the 20s, one set in the 70s, and one set in the 40s. The 20s one is done in a cabaret style, in a kind of musical type. There's an MC and people come up and do numbers. The 40s is in the style of a Rodgers and Hammerstein musical, and the 70s story is in the style of a farce. And all the stories interweave, so you'll have a scene happening in the 70s, and then someone from the 20s will appear behind them and start doing a number, and they'll all disappear. And then, and there are various other things in there as well. So there's a group of young people talking about now and maybe the future and all kinds of things.
Have you got anything else planned for the future coming up? Apart from, you've got a massive show coming in London, and then
a massive one in Southend. Yeah. So one of the ways we work, because we're a kind of pair of directors working together in a company, we kind of alternate projects. And this year it's been Lucy and the Hawk, which is kind of my baby. And next year it's going to be Ollie's baby, which as yet does not have a title. And I shall remain mysterious about it, except to say that it is in some way about high places, and about being at the edge of high places and possibly doing things that other people might think are silly.
Ooh, interesting. Well, thank you very, very, very much. It was fantastic to speak to you.
You too. Thank you very much.